For decades, we were told to fear fat, count calories, and trust the food pyramid. But buried inside the newest dietary guidelines is a quiet admission that changes everything. Many of the rules we built our health around were wrong, and the proof has been hiding in plain sight. For most of our lives, nutrition advice has felt like a set of unbreakable laws. Saturated fat clogs your arteries. Eggs raise your cholesterol. Red meat shortens your life. Calories are all that matter. If you followed the guidelines, you were doing the right thing. If you didn't, you were gambling with your health. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Science doesn't stand still. And recently, without press conferences, without apologies, and without much media attention, the official dietary guidelines began quietly walking back some of their strongest claims. Not with bold headlines, not with a public, "we were wrong," but with subtle changes in language, with topics that simply disappeared, with long-held villains suddenly downgraded to inconclusive or not a nutrient of concern. To understand why this matters, we need to go back to how dietary guidelines came to have so much power in the first place. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, governments were under pressure. Heart disease rates were rising fast and the public wanted answers. At the time, one idea had gained enormous traction: the diet heart hypothesis. The idea was simple and convincing. Eating fat, especially saturated fat, raises cholesterol. Higher cholesterol clogs arteries. Clogged arteries cause heart attacks. It made intuitive sense. Fat was calorie dense. Fat was solid at room temperature. Fat looked guilty. So the first dietary guidelines were born with a clear mission: reduce fat, especially saturated fat, and replace it with carbohydrates. Grains became the foundation of the food pyramid. Vegetable oils were promoted as heart-healthy. Low-fat and fat-free products flooded grocery store shelves. And almost overnight, an entire food system reshaped itself around these rules. But here's the first crack in the story. Even at the time these guidelines were introduced, the evidence was not as solid as most people were led to believe. Much of it came from observational studies. These studies can show associations, but they cannot prove cause and effect. People who ate less fat also tended to smoke less, exercise more, and have higher incomes. Yet fat took the blame. Still, the guidelines stuck, and once advice becomes policy, it's incredibly hard to reverse. Now fast forward several decades. Despite following these guidelines more closely than ever, something strange happened. Obesity rates skyrocketed. Type 2 diabetes exploded. Metabolic diseases became the norm rather than the exception. And yet, people were eating less fat than ever before. So scientists began asking uncomfortable questions. One of the first major reversals involved dietary cholesterol. For years, cholesterol in food was treated like poison. Eggs were the prime example. One egg yolk contains about 185 milligrams of cholesterol, and for a long time the recommended daily limit was no more than 300 milligrams. That meant one egg a day was pushing it. People switched to egg whites. Breakfast menus changed. Entire generations grew up believing eggs were bad for their hearts. But as better research emerged, something surprising became impossible to ignore. For most people, the cholesterol you eat has very little impact on the cholesterol in your blood. Your liver produces the majority of your cholesterol. When you eat more cholesterol, your body often compensates by making less. This feedback system is tightly regulated. Large review studies and controlled trials kept finding the same thing. Dietary cholesterol was not strongly associated with heart disease in the general population. And then quietly, it happened. In the 2015-2020 dietary guidelines, cholesterol was no longer listed as a nutrient of concern. The exact wording said there was no appreciable relationship between consumption of dietary cholesterol and serum cholesterol. Think about that for a moment. A nutrient that had been demonized for decades was suddenly no longer a problem. No apology, no announcement, just a line removed. That alone should make anyone pause and ask what else might be wrong. Next came saturated fat. This one is more complicated, and that's exactly why the guidelines have started to soften rather than fully reverse their stance. For years, saturated fat was painted with a single brush. Butter, cheese, red meat, coconut oil, all treated as equally dangerous. The advice was simple: eat less saturated fat and replace it with polyunsaturated fats, mainly from vegetable oils. But newer research began to challenge this oversimplified view. Scientists started noticing that saturated fat does raise LDL cholesterol, but LDL itself is not a single thing. There are different types of LDL particles: Larger, fluffier LDL particles appear to be far less harmful than small, dense LDL particles. And guess what? Diets higher in refined carbohydrates and sugar tend to increase the small, dense LDL, the more dangerous kind. Meanwhile, diets higher in fat, including saturated fat, often increase the larger, less harmful LDL particles. At the same time, saturated fat was found to raise HDL cholesterol, the so-called good cholesterol, and lower triglycerides when it replaced refined carbs. In other words, the context mattered. What you eat saturated fat with matters more than saturated fat alone. This created a problem for the old narrative, because if saturated fat isn't inherently dangerous, but refined carbohydrates are, then decades of low-fat advice may have pushed people in the wrong direction. So what did the guidelines do? They didn't fully clear saturated fat, but they started emphasizing dietary patterns instead of single nutrients. They began focusing more on limiting added sugars and refined grains, and they stopped talking about fat as the primary villain. Again, no press conference, just a shift in emphasis. Another quiet admission came with sugar. For years, sugar was treated as just empty calories, bad for your teeth maybe, but not uniquely harmful. A calorie was a calorie, according to the old model. But mounting evidence showed that added sugars, especially in liquid form, have unique metabolic effects. They spike insulin, they promote fat storage, they increase liver fat, they disrupt appetite regulation, and suddenly, sugar was no longer just extra calories. The guidelines began placing strict limits on added sugar intake. In some versions, they recommended no more than 10% of total calories from added sugars, and even hinted that lower might be better. That was a major shift. If all calories were truly equal, sugar wouldn't need special treatment, yet there it was, singled out. Then there's the issue of ultra-processed foods. Earlier guidelines focused on nutrients, fat, carbs, protein, vitamins, but newer versions started talking about food quality, processing, and food environments. Why? Because research consistently showed that ultra-processed foods drive overeating, weight gain, and metabolic disease, even when calories and macronutrients are matched. In tightly controlled studies, people eating ultra-processed diets consumed hundreds more calories per day than those eating minimally processed foods without trying to. This directly challenges the old idea that conscious calorie control is the main driver of health. And if that idea falls apart, so does much of the old advice. All of these changes point in the same direction. The original guidelines were built on incomplete evidence. They focused too narrowly on single nutrients, and they underestimated how complex human metabolism really is. The newest guidelines don't say this out loud, but between the lines, the message is clear. The story we were told was too simple. And in part 2, we're going to look at the strongest piece of evidence of all, the long-term outcomes, and why the diseases that were supposed to disappear actually got worse. If the original dietary guidelines were truly correct, we would expect one simple outcome over time: better health, fewer heart attacks, less obesity, lower rates of diabetes. That was the promise. But when we look at what actually happened, the results tell a very different story. Since the low-fat, high-carbohydrate guidelines became standard advice, obesity rates have more than tripled. Type 2 diabetes, once considered a rare adult-onset disease, is now common, even in teenagers. Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, virtually unheard of decades ago, now affects roughly 1 in 3 adults in some countries. These trends didn't happen because people suddenly lost willpower. They happened while people were doing exactly what they were told. They switched from butter to margarine, from whole milk to skim, from eggs to cereal, from home-cooked meals to heart-healthy packaged foods. And this is where the most uncomfortable evidence begins to surface. When researchers revisited large clinical trials that originally supported low-fat diets, they noticed something strange. The benefits were either small, inconsistent, or dependent on what replaced the fat. When saturated fat was replaced with refined carbohydrates, there was no improvement in heart disease risk. In some cases, it got worse. When fat was replaced with vegetable oils high in omega-6 fatty acids, results varied. Some markers improved, others didn't. Long-term outcomes were far less impressive than expected. Even more troubling, some reanalyses of older trials found that lowering cholesterol through diet did not consistently reduce overall mortality. In a few cases, people with lower cholesterol actually had higher death rates from non-cardiac causes. This forced scientists to confront a possibility that was once unthinkable. What if lowering cholesterol wasn't the magic bullet it was assumed to be? What if cholesterol was more of a marker than a cause? Over time, focus began to shift toward inflammation, insulin resistance, and metabolic health, concepts barely mentioned in early guidelines. And this is where refined carbohydrates re-enter the story. When fat was removed from foods, something had to replace it. That something was usually starch and sugar. Fat makes food satisfying. Remove it, and appetite goes up. To make food palatable, manufacturers added sweetness and refined grains. The result was food that was easy to overeat, rapidly digested, and constantly spiked blood sugar and insulin. Chronically high insulin is not harmless. It locks fat inside fat cells. It drives hunger. It promotes inflammation. And over time, it leads to insulin resistance, the root of type 2 diabetes and many other chronic diseases. None of this fit neatly into the old calorie balance model, so the guidelines slowly changed their language again. They began emphasizing whole grains instead of just grains. They warned against sugar-sweetened beverages. They acknowledged that weight regulation is influenced by hormones, not just calories. These may sound like small changes, but they represent a massive shift in understanding. Another quiet reversal involved red meat. For years, red meat was lumped together with processed meat and blamed for everything from heart disease to cancer. Headlines were dramatic. Eating meat is as bad as smoking made the rounds. But when higher quality reviews separated processed meat from unprocessed red meat, the picture changed. Processed meats, like hot dogs and cured deli meats, showed more consistent associations with disease. Unprocessed red meat, on the other hand, showed weak or no associations once lifestyle factors were accounted for. This didn't mean red meat was suddenly health food, but it did mean the certainty was gone. And once again, the guidelines adjusted quietly. The language shifted from limit red meat to choose lean meats and consider overall dietary patterns, less accusation, more nuance. Perhaps the most telling admission of all is what the guidelines still struggle to say clearly. They cannot agree on the ideal macronutrient ratio. Some populations thrive on higher carbohydrate diets with minimally processed foods. Others show dramatic improvements in blood sugar, weight, and cardiovascular risk on lower carbohydrate or higher fat diets. Instead of one universal prescription, the evidence now supports metabolic individuality. That directly contradicts the original one-pyramid-fits-all approach. And while the guidelines still hesitate to fully embrace this idea, the cracks are impossible to hide. If fat were truly the primary cause of heart disease, low-fat diets would consistently outperform others. They don't. If calories alone determined weight, ultra-processed foods wouldn't cause overeating when calories are controlled. They do. If cholesterol in food were dangerous, eggs would be clearly linked to heart disease. They aren't, for most people. Each of these contradictions forced a small retreat, not a confession, a revision, a rewording. But when you line them all up, the pattern becomes obvious. The guidelines didn't suddenly discover new truths. They caught up to them. And in part 3, we'll look at why these admissions were so quiet, what still hasn't been corrected, and what this means for how you should actually think about food going forward. So the question becomes, if the evidence has been pointing in this direction for years, why weren't these changes announced loudly and clearly? The answer isn't conspiracy, it's inertia. Dietary guidelines don't exist in a vacuum. They influence school lunches, hospital food, military rations, food labeling laws, and billions of dollars in agricultural subsidies. When guidelines change, entire systems have to change with them. Admitting past mistakes isn't just uncomfortable, it's expensive. There's also the problem of public trust. If officials openly said we were wrong for decades, people wouldn't just question nutrition advice. They'd question all public health guidance. So instead of reversals, we get revisions. Instead of apologies, we get softer language. But the science keeps moving forward, whether institutions like it or not. One of the biggest shifts in recent years is the recognition that health isn't driven by single nutrients, but by metabolic health as a whole. Blood sugar control, Insulin sensitivity, inflammation, gut health, and satiety matter far more than hitting arbitrary percentages of fat or carbs. This is why newer guidelines talk more about food-based patterns rather than nutrient math. They promote vegetables, whole foods, and less sugar, not because vegetables are low calorie, but because they support metabolic health. They warn against ultra-processed foods, not because of fat content, but because of how they hijack appetite and hormones. And perhaps most importantly, they no longer claim there is one perfect diet for everyone. That alone is a quiet but profound admission. Another area where the old advice is slowly unraveling is weight loss. For decades, people were told to eat less and move more. If you weren't losing weight, the implication was clear. You were failing. But research has shown that long-term weight regulation is heavily influenced by hormones, not willpower. When people cut calories without improving food quality, hunger hormones rise, metabolic rate drops, and the body fights to regain the weight. This is why so many people can follow a low-calorie, low-fat diet perfectly and still fail. Newer guidelines avoid blaming individuals. They emphasize sustainable patterns, sleep, stress, and environment. Again, a quiet shift away from the idea that discipline alone determines health. So what does all of this mean for you? It doesn't mean everything you were told was wrong. It means the story was incomplete. Fat was never the sole enemy. Cholesterol was never the villain it was made out to be. Calories were never the full explanation. The real drivers of chronic disease are more complex and more human. Highly processed foods, constant sugar exposure, disrupted appetite signals, sedentary lifestyles combined with overconsumption of foods engineered to bypass satiety. When you view the guidelines through this lens, the quiet admissions start to make sense. They didn't flip the table. They slowly moved the pieces. And if you read them carefully today, the message is no longer avoid fat at all costs. It's eat real food most of the time. It's limit sugar and ultra-processed products. It's support your metabolism instead of fighting it. That may not sound revolutionary, but compared to where we started, it's a complete reversal. The irony is that many people figured this out long before the guidelines caught up. Traditional diets, ancestral eating patterns, and cultures that never feared natural fats didn't experience modern epidemics of metabolic disease. Science didn't invent this wisdom, it rediscovered it. The guidelines didn't loudly admit they were wrong, but if you know how to read between the lines, the proof is already there. What makes this story so important isn't just that the guidelines changed, it's how they changed. There was no moment where officials stood up and said, "We made a mistake." No acknowledgement of the confusion, fear, or guilt that millions of people carried around food for decades. Instead, the admissions were buried in technical language, softened recommendations, and quiet omissions. But your body felt the consequences long before the paperwork caught up. People blamed themselves for struggling with weight. They feared foods that humans had eaten for thousands of years. They trusted advice that sounded scientific, even when it didn't match their lived experience. And now, slowly, the truth is emerging. Health is not about chasing numbers on a label. It's not about demonizing single foods or nutrients. And it's not about forcing your body to obey rules that ignore how biology actually works. The new guidelines, without saying it outright, are finally pointing back to something simpler and more honest. Real food, metabolic health, and individual context matter more than rigid dogma. That doesn't mean nutrition science is settled. It never will be. But it does mean blind certainty should make us cautious, especially when it comes from institutions that take decades to change their minds. The real lesson here isn't about fat, sugar, or cholesterol. It's about thinking critically, questioning confidently delivered advice, and remembering that your health is personal, not political. Because when the rules quietly change, the people who followed them deserve to know why.